Find a new way to live in Toronto's coveted Forest Hill neighborhood. Foray by Canderel blends thoughtful, livable suite design with refined finishes and more than 50,000 square feet of amenities, including wellness spaces, work-from-home areas, fitness facilities, and places to unwind. A modern, elevated community crafted for the life you've earned. Your next home starts from $599,000. Learn more at live@foray.ca. That's live at FORET.ca.
The only way that we can get through this is by not being alone, but by being with each other. Thank you for everyone for joining together with us. I'm Ellin
Bessner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, May 3rd, 2021. Welcome to the CJN Daily.
5 years ago this week, in the middle of the COVID lockdown, the CJN launched a daily news podcast. It was a time defined by isolation, by Zoom seders, work from home, live stream synagogue services, and cut off from elderly relatives in seniors' residences. People were physically apart, but still searching for connection, community, and answers. The podcast started as an experiment. We called it the CJN Daily, and it was a daily, 5 episodes a week. What Jewish Canada sounds like. We brought Canadian Jewish community news highlights in a bite-sized podcast format. And as you heard from the sound, we recorded it at first under a blanket and later in an improvised home studio. We've covered elections and antisemitism, war and protests, grief and resilience, politics and identity, all through Canadian Jewish eyes. From Toronto and Montreal to Florida and Israel, sometimes recording from hotel rooms, in Airbnbs, in closets, and even in parked cars, and in destinations like Aruba, Vietnam, Hungary, Portugal, and Wawa, Ontario, this podcast has traveled with me wherever life and the story happen to be. Over more than 800 episodes later and close to 2 million listens on all our platforms, we've charted the changing story of Canadian life in Canada before and after October 7th. Our show got a new name last year, North Star, North for where Canada is on the map, and Star for the Star of David. And our missions evolved too, as we try to make sense of the turbulent times we're living through and how they've reshaped Jewish life. Today, for our 5th anniversary, we're doing something a little different. My longtime producer, Zach Kauffman, has turned the microphone around, and he's interviewing me about how the show began, how it's changed, some of the big and controversial stories we've covered, and what we've learned along the way about the state of Canada's Jewish community. And what's next? I'm Ellin Bessner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Friday, May 8th, 2026. Welcome to North Star, the flagship podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, made possible thanks to the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granofsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation.
I'm Toba Cooper in Toronto, Ontario.
I'm Anita Neville in Government House in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
I'm Rivka Campbell.
Hi, I'm Paige Megan of the Megan Boys.
I'm Robbie Weisman in Vancouver, Canada.
In Ramat Beit Shemesh, Israel.
In Richmond, Vancouver, British Columbia.
In Saskatoon, Saskatchewan.
And this is what Jewish Canada sounds like.
This is what Jewish Canada sounds like.
This is what Jewish Canada sounds like.
Well, we're here at the Canadian Jewish News' North Star podcast for the 5th anniversary of our show, 5 years since May of 2021. And this time, for a change, I'll be on the other side of the microphone with my producer, Zach Kauffman, who joins me. We're both in Toronto in our studios.
It feels like a pretty big milestone. Well, I'll firstly say Mazal Tov.
And thanks to all your work for getting us here.
It's my pleasure. How does it feel to be on the other side of the interview chair?
You know, it's a lot more nerve-wracking because journalists don't always like to be the story. You like to ask other people.
Well, despite you not liking it, buckle up because this is what this is all about. And I hope we can reflect together on a important and exciting milestone. While we have some listeners who I think have been with us from the beginning, from day one, I imagine that over the past 5 years, other people have jumped in and may not know the story of the genesis of this whole crazy project. When you first launched the show, What did you want the show to be? What was the motivation behind it? What was your vision for it?
We should tell our listeners that this show launched during COVID, which may seem like a million years ago, but it was in the middle of the COVID pandemic. Everyone was working from home. The offices were locked down, schools, synagogues, everything was still to be done online. And the Canadian Jewish News paper, where I grew up reading it, I'm sure you all did too, didn't print anymore because we closed our offices as well. So I was teaching at university and at college. I was teaching journalism, teaching broadcasting and podcasting. And they came to me and said, hey, we need to still reach our community, but they're locked in their homes. The only thing they can do is go for a walk with the dog or in the car or in their kitchen. So how can we reach them safely? And so they said, do a bite-sized daily podcast about Canadian Jewish news. And so I was like, hell yeah, I can't wait to do this. I took early retirement at where I was working at Centennial College to come basically work for free. 5 days a week, 7-minute podcasts with the sort of highlights of news. What it was supposed to be is what we still call it, Zach, what Jewish Canada sounds like, which is a bite-sized look at all the issues impacting Canada's Jewish community of about 400,000 people, whether they're here at home, in Florida or Arizona, in the winter, in Israel, or all points in between. Listen, from the beginning, what I wanted the show to be was the Jewish Joe Rogan. I wanted it to be the biggest Jewish podcast in the world. But to understand what's happening and remember who we are, who our community is.
Do you remember the first episode?
I know what we planned, which was a very lovely, beautiful interview with Linda Frum, Senator Linda Frum, and Michael Levitt, who was the Liberal MP, who basically they shepherded the legislation to have Jewish Heritage Month officially adopted in Canada in 2018. What happened was Mount Meron, the tragedy of Lag BaOmer, happened in 2021, where people were killed in the stampede. And I quickly pivoted and found some experts in Canada and Israel who could explain what this Mount Meron thing was all about. And we did that. And then there was the war. So we pivoted to the war. And we eventually got that episode on, but not the first day.
As I've learned, you have to be really nimble doing this job. And I think you really try your best to really keep a pulse on centering what people are thinking about right now. So when you first launched, what was the initial feedback you got? Did it feel exciting? Did it feel scary? Tell me about that just initial launch phase.
Well, I mean, it's a different world than our product now, as our listeners who are listening now. If you go back to our first couple of stories, the audio, I have to tell you, I recorded it under a blanket in our basement with a really old microphone and a terrible laptop. It sounded so bad, but I was scared. And we got 3,500 listens in the first week.
Before all of this, you said that you were a journalism prof, but even before that, you were at CTV, you had time at CBC, you were at mainstream outlets that see themselves as sort of reporting from a very neutral standpoint. At least that's the way they see themselves.
That was before. They're not neutral now. Let's go anyway.
I just mean in their viewpoint, in their audience, they're trying to appeal to everyone. Then coming into CJN, you're speaking to a particular community and trying to report seeing through a particular community's lens. I'm curious how that is for you, to be both like an insider and an outsider. Things aren't arm's length.
When I was at CBC, CTV, Globe and Mail, and a foreign correspondent, you couldn't wear your identity in public, just like you couldn't have a lawn sign or show any...
you couldn't say I'm a liberal.
Ethic. No, or definitely not.
Or whatever. You can't have a partisan affiliation in some way.
No, not publicly. In your private life, that's how we were trained. But I also couldn't advocate for the community. And I couldn't show any emotion if I saw like a Nazi war criminal story, which I did for the CBC, but I had to be like sort of, the press guy with the hat and be very stoic. And so here I was able to finally work for stories that impacted me personally, that I cared deeply about in a community that I grew up in my family, 2-3 generations. But it's also tricky because you report on the community where you actually go to the JCC, you go to the grocery store, you go to shul, etc. And you have to be careful because people do not like getting their name in a bad light if they deserved it or if they did something that's not, kosher. And we still have to report it, but you don't want to burn your bridges either. They won't talk to you.
It's like both professional bridges and personal bridges. Friends and people who you love, and you're in a bit of an awkward position, I imagine.
And also, it's like when I was at the mainstream and media, I didn't have to think about every story as, is this good for the Jews or is this bad for the Jews?
Do you think about that now?
I do. It doesn't prevent me from doing stories most of the time, but I get regular emails. I know you see them from listeners and viewers every single day who listen, that make us part of their routine in their ears or their car. And I appreciate that. It's like having a wider, extended family. I have people who listen in their ears every day. That is such a privilege. And it's a wonderful, dedicated, loyal, niche audience. I'm very grateful.
Speaking of seeing these emails myself, something else that often strikes me about them is that, again, because we have this national lens, they can be from people, in more isolated communities, people who don't have the type of community infrastructure that there might be in Toronto or in Ottawa or Montreal or whatever, where there's every night there's another book talk, there's another this. To hear I'm from a small town in Alberta, or I'm in PEI, or I'm somewhere, and this is my not lifeline, but my main way that I'm staying connected feels really cool.
It definitely is, and that's happened a lot.
You gestured a little bit previously at, while there's so much nachas that you get from people recognizing you and being that lifeline, I wanted to ask about some more difficult moments in our show's history, and that's particularly around stories that may have not put some of our community's institutions in the best light, or where they haven't met the standards that some might have hoped for them. I'm thinking in particular about our coverage of Benjamin's funeral home, things happening at JNF Canada when they lost their charitable status. I know you got a lot of difficult feedback, and I wanted to hear if you could elaborate on what you heard and where you think it was coming from for people.
Well, I'm going to talk about Benjamin's first. It was the earlier sort of bombshell investigation that we did. So for our listeners who don't know, you can go back to our website. We'll put the links. A grieving family came to me with a consumer story about how the funeral home Benjamin's in Toronto took advantage of them, they felt, when their son died, and not only inexplicably put the wrong charities on the funeral notice, but then they put their own Benjamin's Foundation instead, and then took 10% of the fees off of each memorial donation to cover admin costs without notifying the family that this was happening.
If I donate $20 in the name of Joe Schmo, Benjamin's would take 10%
off. For admin costs, when donors, give to like the Benjamin Foundation, it's sort of like it was a holding pot for people who didn't know which charity they wanted eventually to give money to. So Benjamin's would hold it for them in trust. So a wider investigation of the business practices of this company revealed many people came forward to me about being upsold, about being overcharged, about otherwise deceptive marketing practices. The Ontario Regulatory Agency slapped Benjamin's with consequences and hefty fines. But then Benjamin's sued the agency for libel, and they threatened me. They sent their lawyers after me, threatening to sue me if I wrote anything. We gave them ample opportunity to speak. They never gave us an interview, only a couple of emailed answers. They promised the rabbis who came forward to condemn them that they would change, that they would fix their website, that they would advertise more clearly, the price list, the funeral costs.
But you got a lot of negative reactions from the community saying, this is the largest Jewish funeral home in the country. What are you doing taking pot shots at them?
When people don't live up to the ethics of like derech eretz and good business practices, you don't hide this under a rug, even if it's the biggest pillars of the community who do very good for other people. But in this case, it wasn't. So we'll talk about JNF now. And that was a much more recent story when the Canada Revenue Agency stripped the historic Jewish charity of its charitable status for reasons that the government said they weren't meeting the rules for their books, for their records, for their supervision of the projects in Israel. We covered it from JNF's point of view and how they were blindsided. And then the government gave us their side of the story, the hundreds of pages of legal documents, which was the back and forth that they'd had with JNF for maybe 30 to 40 years. And literally, and then I went to the JNF and I said, okay, what do you think? We had an hour interview with their CEO, and they went ballistic. They went after me personally, professionally. They tried to shut the CJN's donors down. You know, a story fell in our lap. I reported it. And yes, there's probably antisemitism at work in the government, but they also messed up for 35 years and didn't tell anyone about it. And so it was very difficult. People were screaming at me and our CEO at a meeting, but I felt that it was our mission as a newspaper to show the truth.
Right. Can I push you on that a little bit? I think there could be some people who would say, there's lots of other outlets, let mainstream outlets pile on the Jewish community. Why should we be spreading bad things about Jews? What would you respond to that claim?
I love that question, and I think it deserves a really simple answer. The Jewish community in Canada collects millions of dollars from people and receives tons of subsidies from the federal government, and people should know who they're donating to, and they can make a choice, and they can have accountability, and they can push back and say, you know, I'm not comfortable with this, or they can ask questions. But that's not anti-Semitism. That's asking for people to do better, do their job better, so that the continuation of these charities goes, like it continues to exist, instead of resisting everything and not cleaning your house. And then there's the other side, which is, yes, there's a different atmosphere now in Canada than when this audit was done in 2013, for example. So do everything to be squeaky clean, and this is all charities. Coming up, why before October 7th, I didn't think I was ever coming back to work, but then I realized returning to the show might be the only way forward.
It's always important to have some degree of hope to hold on to, but this has been above and beyond anything bad that has happened here.
I'm Ellin Bessner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Sunday, October the 8th, 2023. Welcome to a special edition of the CJN Daily on the Israeli war. We're a podcast.
Moving on with the sort of history and timeline of the show, I think a sort of big inflection point, both for the world, for the Jewish people, for Canadian Jews, for our little show, was October 7th. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to sort of talk about how did that change the show for you, both what you wanted from the show, what you think the audience wanted. And I'll also put in here, some of our listeners may know that while there was this sort of national, really difficult moment, this was also a difficult moment for you personally. It was in the wake of the loss of your son. And for so many reasons, it was a difficult moment for us and our show and our team and our audience. Can you reflect a little bit on what that moment was?
Right. So, I mean, thank you for bringing up Evan's name. Our son was actually a part of our show during the pandemic for a summer job. He was one of our producers. But yeah, when October 7th happened, I wasn't working. I was on bereavement leave because he had passed away in July. And I wasn't ever sure that I was going to ever come back to work. Then on October 7th, I knew that this was what I was supposed to do, is get out of bed, get to work. I didn't have a uniform. I didn't have, ammunition. This was what I trained for my whole life, to be a journalist and tell stories. And our community badly needed explanation. They needed communication. They needed to make sense of a senseless thing. And so I knew Evan would want me to do that. And so I got to work, and we worked 24/7 nonstop for weeks and months, because we had to we had an audience with expectations. They needed to hear what's going on in Israel. Are my family safe? They all had social media, but making bigger sense of it and showing what we were doing, what Canadians were doing, that they were going to volunteer, that they were sending, money, that they had rallies. And we covered all this stuff. It was traumatic, but for all of us, but personally for me, because I had to interview grieving families too, of the 8 members of the community who were murdered. And it was very hard to have the tenderness and also the experience and know how to interview victims of trauma. But on the other hand, who better than somebody who's an experienced journalist who's done it and is living it herself? And I sometimes shared and sometimes I didn't what I was going through because our kids were the same age. I think that was helpful to them. Sometimes I had to go after the interview and lie on my bed and cry for a while because it was hard. And we have all had mental health, physical health issues, stress, anxiety for the last 2.5 years, having to cover all this stuff. So yeah, we changed, the audience changed, and Canada changed. Canada changed.
How do you mean?
Well, Canada, for Jews, became a place where many people are questioning if we belong here anymore. You and I have done stories regarding Plan B. People moving to Florida, Machaya, Florida, they call it, or Panama, or I know 2 my close friends, or one bought a place in Jerusalem, one is going there to look for one. Where is it safe? We don't feel safe. A lot of people don't. Or we're even having the conversation that we have never had in my generation. So that's been hard. Politically, I think a lot of Jews feel very abandoned by the powers that be, all levels of government, and living under siege like that has been a really hard thing for our community. What upsets me, we've discovered about like the community before and the community now, there is so much polarization in the Jewish community, never mind outside the Jewish community. People aren't talking to each other. People can't listen to different sides, to different opinions. There's no or very little willingness to be united as a community. And that's really been disturbing to me. And I don't see it getting better. There's very right-wing, very left-wing. Nobody trusts the other side. They don't even want to engage. It's really, really sad. And I think that's if I were to say a win for the Hamas and Iran, that's a win, is that you destabilize the Canadian diaspora community.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually about that. You said like a lot of polarization in the community. I think that there's people who feel like the amount of polarization is maybe overstated, that people who have divergent views about Israel, critical views about Israel, are very small minority, and really the vast majority are very much aligned. Does that feel true to you? Or maybe there's more diversity than that lets on?
I do. I think partly it's a generation gap.
You think that?
Yep, I do. And I've seen it. Many people who they don't even want to engage.
It sounds like you do think there is more diversity than, some of our listeners might think.
I 100% know there is.
Yeah.
And I think your podcast that you did called
In Good Faith,
showed that. It's an important thing. People need to think. They need to be willing to expand and consider other points of view. And I don't see that very much in what we've been hearing, especially on social media, where it's all echo chambers. Yeah.
That is exactly the place that I wanted to go to next. To me, that's the big divide that I see in our community. There's people who are very much online, who are constantly consuming a fire hose of a mix of true to embellished to not true outrages about awful things that are happening to Canadian Jews. And I think people who are constantly getting that mainlined into them are very scared. And people who are not online in the same way, they don't go about their day in a constant state of peril.
Even, like, for example, Rabbi Steve Wernick from Beth Tzedek wrote a piece recently that during the preparations for the recent Yom HaShoah commemoration in Toronto, his synagogue delivered these little memorial, yahrzeit candles with barbed wire, a photo of barbed wire in yellow, so people could light them at their home on Yom HaShoah. People called the police. They thought it was a hate crime. They didn't realize it came from their own shul.
But they saw a Yudin star. They saw the barbed wire.
Whatever they saw.
They saw a Holocaust thing.
People are like this at all times. They don't know when the police SWAT teams are now patrolling the synagogues. Nothing's happening. It's just a patrol. People are like, alarm, alarm, alarm. And it's really hard to absorb all this stuff. Also, people make stuff up, and then everybody goes, well, did you see what happened? The helicopter, and it was fine. It was nothing. So, unfortunately, this is how the sort of people are living that are online these days. I also do want to credit it, though, when the synagogues were shot at in March 7th, March 6th, on that Shabbat weekend. That's how I found out about it first. I found out at 6 in the morning because somebody posted it on a Facebook group who was providing security. So it has its pros and its cons. However, I think you raised a really important point to sort of come to the end of our conversation. And that is that living in Canada now, if you're always thinking about hate and anti-Semitism, it's not good for our community in terms of the future. And here's why. The beauty of being Jewish and all its facets after October 7th had to be sort of put to the sidelines for that. There was no appetite for it. People just wanted to hear about the, security, safety, the hostages, whatever, and didn't want to hear about religion or anything that makes being Jewish wonderful. And we tried to sort of decide when it was okay. Should we start when we're going to offend people? And it wasn't until really last fall that we kind of started putting a story or two in about non-anti-Semitism things. And more recently, so I did a story about a woman who painted all 54 parshas in the Torah on these beautiful panels, and it's a wonderful project. That is really important to have, because if all we think about is how terrible it is and we have to be behind high walls and what have you, then no wonder people want to move, because that's not how you live a beautiful Jewish life. And so people who are not constantly on social media can do that more easily. And I think that's a very important thing people have to keep in mind.
I hope that we can communicate that to people. Not that their fears are invalid, but also there is real, thick, important, exciting, invigorating Jewish life happening all around them, from Moncton to Victoria to Calgary to everywhere.
Unfortunately, our audience, when I speak around the country, they ask me, was there any hope? There's a little hope.
What's your hope?
The hope is that we are now what I've coined muscular Judaism. After October 7th, they call them October 8th. People, you just mentioned it. People have mobilized. They've started to get involved in the community. They've made new community groups that are active and lobbying and petitioning and marching and knitting, hats and doing all kind lawfare. They're doing, fighting in the courts. So that's a really good thing. And if you can say a silver lining to the 5 years that we've been covering news here at the CJN's, it used to be the Daily, now it's the North Star.
I guess going into our next 5 years, are you feeling energized? Are you feeling, how are you feeling going into what's next?
If they would stop shooting at synagogues, my life would be a lot better, honestly. And we could do, Jewish stories that, like when they canceled the Wacky Mac production in Canada. I would rather do that story than canceling an artist, I have to tell you. But yeah, we still have a big role to play. And, you can come to the CJN's North Star and hear things you will never hear anywhere else in a way that would never be told. But let's thank the audience for being loyal, for listening, for feeding back to us, for giving us tips and suggestions, and tell a friend. We want to grow. I need to do more. Thank you for being on board with me for the last 4 years. Couldn't do it without you.
It's been my pleasure. It's been an adventure riding this roller coaster, but it's really important. And there are places covering, American Jewish life. There are places that cover global Jewish life. But I think Canada has a story to tell. I think Canadian Jews have a story to tell. I think we have something important to contribute. And it feels really good to be able to be a part of articulating that.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounded like for this anniversary episode of North Star. Brought to you by our longtime sponsors, Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky Gluskin, through their charitable foundation. And before that, special thanks to our founding donor, Metropia. Zachary Judah Kauffman is our senior producer. Izzy Hellenchild joined the team as a producer. Michael Freeman's the executive producer. Alicia Richler is our editorial director. A special nod to my family, and friends for your support. And to all our CJN colleagues present and past, we couldn't have done it without you. Please write to us at info@thecjn.ca and suggest how this podcast has impacted you. And whether you've been with us since those early lockdown days, or whether you haven't missed an episode and you know who you are, or whether you found us more recently, a heartfelt thank you for listening.